Morning, everyone. I hope you're well. I've had a shave, so all rejoice. Very different video today, a bit sort of out there. But I just want to I've just been pondering about a point, and I think it's kind of worth exploring it a little bit and see how you think. Um, One of the interesting things I talk to my clients about, or I should say they talk to me about, is obviously how their particular orientation, or whether that's sexual or gender orientation, impacts their day-to-day life. And of course, some have reasonable experiences, especially at home, where people kind of appreciate, accept them, and all the rest of it, and some do not, where parents, families, and so on just seem to be incapable of accepting the orientation of this particular person. But almost it's is the implication that, and this is a comment I've heard recently, like, well, people are only gay, trans, I don't know, non-binary, whatever these days, because they're allowed to be, because the law says they're allowed to be. So the implication being that because we're now talking about these things, that's why we have more of it. Clearly, in antiquity, in Roman times, in ancient Greece, in pretty much any era of history, there were no gay, trans, non-binary people at all. This is a modern. The implication here is that it is a modern invention, and the only reason people are allowed to be this is because it's now legal, because we've gone so woke that we're now accepting of everything, even if it's clearly nonsense. Again, this is the opinion of some of the family members or acquaintances of some of my clients. But this made me think about the way we actually understand gender and sexual orientation, and the way it's kind of now gone a little bit mainstream in a sense. There's a lot more, shops, companies, whatever, which are accused of sort of rainbow washing. Really, they put a the rainbow flag all over their marketing. But whether they actually do anything for the community, it's a different question. But the interesting thing here is the idea how kind of society has gone against certain concepts. So what I'm trying to say, for example, if you look at one of my favorite topics, comics and superheroes and all the rest of it. Now, in the old generation comics, if you like, or storylines, a lot of the villains have now were obsessed by power. Even in the 70s, if you think about things like Star Wars, you had the evil empire, you have people that were obsessed by power or destroying the world. That's what the villains were trying to do, and the goodies were trying to change, obviously stop them. So you had very clear baddies who were hell-bent on destroying the world, and you had goodies which were standing up against this evil, right? That's so slightly changed, and in order to make the recent villains more palatable, if you like, what we now have really is villains who are trying to not destroy the world or take over the world, but sometimes just change things. And I wonder whether that's a ploy to make a character more interesting, or to actually slightly condition us the fact that if we want to change the status quo, that's some sort of a villainous act. Because if you think about people like Thanos and other comparable villains of recent history, now, whereas obviously we can argue about the methodology and whether getting rid of half the universe is a thing or not, that's a different thing. But the idea about saving the world by thinking about resources and about how those are distributed, that's an interesting concept. But he's the villain. And actually, the goodies, if you like, are trying to preserve the status quo rather than fight against evil as such. So, if you put this in terms of how we now view the LGBTQIA plus community, is this kind of a message that the social media or the kind of creative construct is now trying to tell us, that basically we've got to a point where anyone that challenges the status quo is some sort of villainous thing? And is it the fact that we're now accepting that the issue of gender and sexuality and so on is so much more complicated than we once imagined, that somehow this now makes us threaten the status quo, and therefore somehow we need to be reconditioned as a society to kind of see change or changes of the status quo as a bad thing? And it's something I like to call about the Disneyfication of society, in the sense that we have often this kind of concept of the zero to hero, somebody who's completely no good at something, becoming the hero and becoming brilliant at it. Because there's so many, for example, popular culture, Disney films that tell us that it doesn't matter how bad you are at something, if you believe in it hard enough, then you can still win. And this has been certainly an attempt to kind of suggest that everybody's an individual in their own rights and everybody's special in some sort of way and all the rest of it, which is quite likely true. But also it's an attempt to suggest that all opinions are valid in the same way. So what I'm trying to say is that if I have a fact and you have an opinion, somehow we have to put them on the same weighing scale, which is clearly not a thing. You are allowed to have an opinion, of course. You are allowed to have the opinion that there's only two genders, and that's the end of that for you, and that's your opinion. Fair enough. But that doesn't make it a fact. That doesn't mean that I have to consider that opinion on the same weighing scale with a lot of research that's proving something quite different. And I see this, for example, when people are interviewed and saying things like, well, I don't know, but I know it in my heart that this, that, and the other happened. And I'm just wondering, what does that mean? What does it mean that you know it in your heart that this is this and then the other? Knowing it in your heart and actually having a factual information about something is irrelevant. I see this in people that are attacking, especially the trans community, by saying that, well, the trans community is responsible for grooming and all sorts of other nonsense. And they say, well, I've done my own research about this. Googling things isn't research. You having basically a completely biased opinion based on one incident that you might have heard or read does not constitute research. So what I'm trying to say is that I just wonder how popular cultures change, firstly from basically trying to get us to believe that everybody's opinion is equally valid, which there's arguments about that, but more in a sense that value and fact, opinion and fact, sorry, have the same value, which clearly isn't a thing. But now, whether our acceptance of things like gender and sexual orientation and the myriad of forms that takes is now threatening the status quo. So, in popular culture, the message that we constantly being driven into us is that we have this kind of faulty anti-hero that threatens the status quo, which must be stopped at all costs. And is that a sign of how our societies become more complicated, or is that just a different message that we're fed on a regular basis? Goodies and baddies were clear cut. Goodies were trying to destroy the world, baddies were trying to stop them. Now, baddies are trying to change the world, and the goodies, so-called goodies, are trying to stop them. Why would that be? Why would we try to portray change of the norm as necessarily being a threatening thing? I just find that quite interesting. And equally, in order to be more inclusive, a lot of popular culture now includes LGBTQI plus characters, but a lot of them are very, incredibly stereotypical. And then, of course, they are always accused of just paying lip service to a certain thing without having substance. And sometimes, yes, that substance is lacking. Sometimes not, but sometimes it is. More often than not, it is. So, to kind of conclude this rant, which if you've managed to follow it so far, you've done really well, is kind of based on two things. Firstly, no, we do not. Sorry, the trans, gay, LGBTI plus community does not exist just because we allow them to be. They don't need our permission. They don't need our validation in that respect, and they don't exist just because it's legal to be that. They've always been here, and I would surmise they will always be here. And it's our job to basically, celebrate them as we'd celebrate any form of life, not just saying, "Oh well, don't ask, don't tell. You kind of exist, but we don't want to talk about you," sort of thing. That's one. And secondly, it's this kind of almost popular culture attempt to portray the status quo as being the most important thing, and therefore any attempt on changing that status quo is quote unquote villainous. And lastly, is this kind of idea where an opinion and fact have the same power or have the same authority, which clearly they don't. So I hope you have a good rest of the week. Ponder on those things if you've managed to stay with me so far, and all the very best to you.